So recently I saw a special showing of Star Wars Return of the Jedi, and it's about 40 years ago that this film was released. 7 years before I was born. Now that we've had more than enough time to process this movie in all of its glory, and maybe sometimes shortcomings, as some people have pointed out over the years, more recent years I should say, and with all the newer movies that have come out since then, how do we look at Return of the Jedi now? How do I look at it anyway? I would like to give my own perspective and my own thoughts on how I think this film holds up in the context of the entire Star Wars timeline and as a movie on its own. I did review this once before, about maybe 5.5-ish years ago. I was a totally different person back then and not really as experienced as I am now. I still am learning a lot as I go on, but I hope that I've managed to improve how I present myself since then. Having watched the movie again, my thoughts on it haven't really changed a whole lot. Although I did notice a couple of things on rewatch and some little things that I thought, oh wait, you could have done it this way and maybe you wouldn't have had this problem. But then again, if that were to happen, we wouldn't have gotten the rest of the movie in the way that we did afterwards. So in some ways you have to let things play out the way they do. I think it goes with just about any piece of media, actually. And this might be a hot take in some ways, but this has always been my favorite Star Wars movie. But besides Episode 7, this was the one that I always gravitate towards the most. I just love me a good ending to a trilogy, and I think for this trilogy alone, this is a solid, nice little bow that you can wrap up with. This isn't really the most popular Star Wars movie. I think if you had to rank it in general with the Star Wars fans, it's probably somewhere in the middle tier, or maybe somewhere in the top tier, but maybe a little lower. The Ewoks have been a big turnoff for some people, and there's some reviewers on YouTube that have pointed out certain things in the last few years. I'm not going to mention who they are, but I would like to also maybe kind of address some of those criticisms while also acknowledging those things. It doesn't ruin the movie for me completely, but there's a couple of things that I heard some people say that I thought, wait, hold on. You're looking at it through a very narrow mind here. Let me provide my own insight for you. I'm not trying to brag or pat myself on the back, but I don't want that to be just the only voice out there. I'd like to try in some way to anyone who's listening, get my voice out there, and maybe we can have a more interesting conversation. I don't expect everybody to acknowledge it, but if some people can, then I can sleep soundly. The movie takes place about a year after the events of Empire Strikes Back. A new Death Star is being built by the Empire, and Vader has come to oversee the preparations while also letting the Empire know that the Emperor himself is going to oversee the final stages of construction. Han Solo is still being held by Jabba, Luke is preparing some kind of a rescue plan for him, and the Rebel Alliance is trying to form their one final plan to defeat the Empire once and for all. This is the moment for all the galaxy. This is the big one. Now, in expanded universe lore, obviously, the Battle of Jakku was another big final indicator, but this was the final blow for the Empire before they fell and crumbled into a pile of ash, at least until they rose into the First Order, but that's neither here nor there. I think this film was co-written by George Lucas or written by George Lucas, I'm not sure, but I know he had some kind of a creative hand in this, obviously. A man named Richard Marquand was behind the director's chair, although I think in some scenes it's a little bit noticeable that Lucas was behind the camera, maybe with the Ewok scenes. We'll talk about that later. Either way, I still think it's very consistent with the other two films. The tone is very similar, although it's a lot more upbeat and happy and optimistic, since this is a beacon of hope for the galaxy that the Empire is going to fall. As far as the second Death Star, it's pretty lazy of a creative choice that they would kind of revert back to that. And it almost kind of drives me crazy when people say the same thing about Force Awakens many years later. It's another Death Star. It's the same movie. Return of the Jedi had a very similar thing. Only difference is this one wasn't fully complete. If I had to guess really, what would lead the Emperor to want to create another Death Star? Maybe he learned from the previous mistakes that they had with the original Death Star, so maybe he found a way to improve on that. And given that this is under construction still at this point, the Rebellion's not going to take any chances when it's complete, because they saw what it was able to do in the original Death Star with Alderaan. My guess is that the Emperor thought, okay, they're definitely going to try to plan some attack right now, so I'm going to set up a trap for them, and when they least expect it, I'm going to get the drop on them, and that'll be the end of the Rebellion. It's probably a reach to assume that stuff, but that's just how I've always seen it. I could easily see Palpatine coming up with some kind of plan like that, but obviously, as Luke says to him, his overconfidence is his weakness. And I just have to say real quick, I am going to address some of the changes that were made in the special editions. Some I'm okay with, some I actually really like, and some that I still don't want in there at all. Hence why I bought the Harmy Despecialized edition, because it's infinitely better, but we'll talk about that later. But with his arrival on the new Death Star, Vader tells his officer that the Emperor is going to arrive and oversee the final preparations, and it's a great way of establishing the fear that the Emperor has over his subordinates even, because we hear about him a couple times throughout the previous two movies, and we even see a hologram in Empire. Little luminous, scary tone from the music that's played by John Williams in this scene, and the actor who plays the officer, I'm not going to try to say the officer's name because it's too much of a mouthful to even try. He's able to perfectly convey that sense of fear and dread dread over the notion of, oh my god, the Emperor's coming? And I pointed this out in my original review some years ago. This little gesture that Vader throws at this officer when he's giving him the welcoming pleasantries. I love that little detail so much, and I wonder if that was improv by David Prowse when he was walking in the suit. And how could I not mention this delivery of this doubling their efforts?
We shall double our efforts.
Try saying that 5 times faster. I hope so, Commander, for your sake. The Emperor is not as forgiving as I am. Then we cut to Luke's home planet of Tatooine, where 3PO and R2-D2 are going to Jabba's palace to try to see what's going on with Han Solo. And then we meet Jabba's advisor, Bib Fortuna.
Fortuna! They wanna wonder.
My.
Lucha! Oh, and did I mention that Jabba's guards are pigmen? Kramer from Seinfeld would be horrified.
Oh, God! It's a big man! A big man!
But this section of the movie, I think, noticeably goes on for a huge stretch. I think maybe for about 25 to 30 minutes or so. And then we get right into the action of planning for the Death Star attack and then going to Endor. It's kind of similar to A New Hope, where it was very drawn out and explaining how this world works and everything, but it was appropriate because at that time, it was an introduction to this universe. We didn't know what was going on with it. We didn't know how the universe worked or what the Force was. By now, we have a better idea of how it goes, but I think sometimes it kind of is noticeable that there's certain things that, okay, I get it. You want to show off these cool designs and everything, which is really amazing to look at. And for 1983, these practical effects still hold up. The people who designed the sets and the makeup and the prosthetics and all that other stuff deserve a huge amount of applause and credit for it. But what I do like is how I think that Luke knew that Jabba was not going to go along with their first stages of their plan. I think he wanted to use his attempt as a last resort just in case one didn't work. And ultimately, his attempts didn't work out anyway, where he tried to negotiate through R2 and 3PO. Then he would have had Leia show up as a bounty hunter in disguise. Then she would try to break them out. If that didn't work, which obviously it didn't, Luke would then come in and try to resolve everything, but I think he wanted to prepare for all possibilities just in case one didn't work. And 3PO is pretty oblivious to what's happening. He knows that they're going to try to get him out, but he obviously doesn't know all the details, although I think R2 has a better idea of what's going on considering the bond between the two of them. And it's pretty obvious with 3PO's response when Luke says,
"As a token of my goodwill, I present to you a gift. These 2 droids."
What did he say?
yeah, he has no clue what's going on. But it's in this scene where we actually meet Jabba the Hutt. If you didn't see the special edition version where we meet Jabba for the first time, in the unaltered cut, this is the first time that we meet him. We hear his name dropped a few times, similar to the Emperor, but then we actually get a full look at him and how just ugly and disgusting this guy really is, and slimy and conniving, and how he doesn't want to negotiate or listen to reason at all. And the design of this character is very, very impressive. Using a certain type of casserole for the sound effects when he goes to lick Leia with his disgusting tongue.
Oh, I can't bear to watch.
But R2 and 3PO are now put into service droids for Jabba, and Lando is actually nearby as one of Jabba's guards. And I think Jabba might know who he is. I could be wrong. Maybe he thought initially that he didn't really want anything to do with Han. Maybe a small moment or two would have sufficed. And then we have the rock band music scene, or in this case, the pop music scene in the special edition. I think it's called Lapti Nek in the original cut. I much prefer that. Obviously, I don't want to sound like a typical Star Wars fan when I talk about this one and some of the other changes, like Darth Vader's No, which we'll get to. But the reason I don't like this new edition is because, obviously, the fact that it's CGI characters. Now, I'm not against that necessarily, but I think the way that it's used here, I think George Lucas at the time was kind of going in over his head of, look what I can do with these cool toys, look what I can do here. And there's a certain point where this one creature is up close to the camera, and this one character who looks like a Tribble from Star Trek gets really up close to the camera again, and I think in a lot of ways it's very distracting and takes away from the initial fear of Jabba's slave who tries to get away. With the original music, it adds a lot more tension to it, but in this version though, it undercuts it completely. Although I do like these small moments where she falls into the pit and she looks at the door as it's opening, we see that sense of fear build up on her face, knowing that, okay, whatever's behind that door is definitely not friendly. But then this bounty hunter shows up, handing over Chewbacca, and some debate back and forth goes. Jabba offers 35, and the bounty hunter accepts it. But then we get a nod of recognition from Boba Fett. It's simple, yet it tells us everything about this world, where there's a sense of honor and respect among bounty hunters. I know I'm not the first person to say that, but it is a neat little detail. But then in the middle of the night, when everyone's asleep, this bounty hunter wakes up Han Solo from carbonite, and we as the audience are meant to think, wait a minute, what is he doing? Why do you let him go? and it's revealed that it was Leia the whole time and that she's using it as a cover in order to get him out. And I've always really liked this detail that since Han was put in hibernation for so long that his eyesight is completely shot, at least for the time being while his body readjusts to not being in hibernation anymore. I guess as opposed to some other people like in The Mandalorian with that first bounty that Din Djarin captures, probably wasn't in it for too long, but Han was in there for about a year. Odds are there was going to be some damage done. Jabba, I'll pay you triple. You're throwing away a fortune here. Don't be a fool! And we get a really nice, wholesome moment when he reunites with Chewie.
A Jedi Knight! I'm out of it for a little while. Everybody gets delusions of grandeur.
All right, pal. I'm all right.
I swear to God, Harrison Ford's acting in this movie is so great. It just puts a big smile on my face. He may not have been a big fan of the character Han Solo, but I gotta give him credit. He really gave it his all in all of these movies that he was in. And actually, that just occurred to me. I've heard some people argue that maybe Han should have died in Empire Strikes Back, giving the rebellion a reason to rebel against the Empire, where they can all unite under his death, and use that as a final emotional push to fight back against the Empire. That actually would have been a really interesting idea, and I wouldn't disagree with that necessarily, but I'm also really happy that he didn't die, because we wouldn't have gotten these funny moments with him that we do get in this movie. And he was able to come back in Star Wars Episode 7, where he actually had a deeper, layered characterization to him, because that, I think, was Harrison Ford's biggest complaint with the character, is that he didn't really have that much to him other than just being a smug jerk who only cared about money. Obviously, he had his friendship with Chewie and Luke, and his romantic connection with Leia, but other than that, it really wasn't a whole lot for him to get excited about, and I think that's why he would have preferred Han Solo to die in the middle chapter. Obviously, as we know, I think George Lucas or whoever said no, but then with Force Awakens, he was able to get what he wanted. Not just the death, obviously. I'm sorry if I spoiled Star Wars Force Awakens for anyone who doesn't know that. He actually has deeper things going on in that movie with his son Ben Solo, who's Kylo Ren. So, bottom line is, I'm actually glad that they didn't kill him off in this trilogy. Then we get reintroduced to Luke Skywalker, who is a completely different person from what we met in the first two movies. He walks into Jabba's palace and the two guards try to stop him, but without hesitation. First indicator that this is not the same young farm boy that we first met in A New Hope. You will take me to Jabba now. Taku to Jabba now. You serve your master well, and you will be rewarded. Besides his outing in The Last Jedi, I think this is Mark Hamill's best performance as the character. I think Luke was already likable and endearing in the first two movies, but in the first one, he was a very wide-eyed innocent who didn't know any better about what went on in the galaxy. Empire, he was definitely on his way to becoming who we meet in this one, but he still had a lot of hurdles to jump through, and he was still very immature and very impatient with himself. And in this one, in a lot of ways, up until the climactic moment when he stops Darth Vader and the Emperor, he's now become a man. But he's still holding on to that optimism about his father that maybe Anakin Skywalker is still deep down underneath Darth Vader somewhere. He tries to reason with Jabba to let his friends go, and obviously it doesn't work out, and he ends up in the Rancor pit. And this little moment that Luke gives when he sees the Rancor come out of the shadows, it's a little detail that I've always loved. He's horrified and he starts to back up. Out of all the Jedi Knights that we know in the Star Wars universe, or in these Star Wars mainstream films or shows, I guess, besides maybe to a degree Obi-Wan Kenobi and Rey, yes, I mentioned Rey, don't scream at me, please. Luke is probably the most human of all the Jedi that we've seen in the movies, because he's a human being. He's one of us, who experiences all the emotions that you and I do. But before he closes the door on the Rancor, when he tries to open that one door, it occurred to me when I was watching this, I thought, wait, couldn't you use a force push on something, some kind of control panel nearby, and lift the door open that way? But if he did, we wouldn't have got the famous sequence on the sail barge. So sometimes you just have to let things slide. And that's a really big nitpick. It's not that big of a deal. But he manages to close the door on the Rancor, killing it, and we get a really funny yet heartbreaking moment when the Rancor's owner starts to cry over him. I remember one time when I was watching this as a kid, and the other kids in the room at this day camp that I went to when I was about 12 years old, we were all watching the movie, and when that scene happened, all the kids in the room were laughing their butts off, and I was kind of giggling along with it too. So Jabba decides to send them out to the Sarlacc pit, where they're all going to be digested over 1,000 years apparently, according to the translation by 3PO. It's like I thought, let's pass on that, huh? And in the special edition, it looks more like the Piranha Plant from the Super Mario Bros. Video game, where in the original cut, it was just this, and in the special edition it's a CGI digital edition in the movie. I don't hate it, but I don't love it either. I'm just kind of indifferent to it, honestly. I don't really care, but it is pretty obvious that it's a George Lucas edition, if you will. I think that's what we should call the special editions, the George Lucas editions. I'm not trying to sound mean. I remember the days when people were crying about the prequels and the special editions, so let's not act like that never happened. But inevitably, Luke is able to get his lightsaber from R2 after the famous Boy Scout salute that we've seen in memes on the internet a million times, and that it's not actually a blue lightsaber since he lost it in Empire. It's a green lightsaber, which at the time was probably very shocking for a lot of people. Okay, lightsabers can't be just blue or red. They can also be green. There's different flavors of color to them also. Luke starts slashing away at Jabba's guards. Han and Chewie are trying to break free. Boba Fett tries to capture Luke and stop him. Doesn't get anywhere, and Han accidentally launches Boba Fett into the sail barge, who lands into the Sarlacc pit. People have pointed out that this is a really dumb way for Boba Fett to go out, but we all know, if we've seen the show, and in the expanded universe stuff, the original expanded universe, we know that he didn't die. Even so, I think it wouldn't have hurt to have him at least have one standoff with Han Solo, since he was the one who turned him over to Jabba. Nevertheless, though, it's kind of a hilarious way to die, because he's hyped up as this really scary bounty hunter that everybody's afraid of, and he goes out in the dumbest way possible, or so we think he does. Which, when he falls down the slope of the Sarlacc pit, I thought, see you in Season 2 of Mandalorian. And we get a really cathartic moment where Leia finally gets her revenge on Jabba by killing him in a chokehold. As far as the slave outfit from Carrie Fisher, a lot of guys were ogling over this back in the day, and I think even today some people still find that really easy on the eyes. I honestly was never crazy about that. God rest her soul. I'm not trying to sound disrespectful to Carrie Fisher in the slightest at all. I just honestly never saw what the big deal was, other than to make guys go, "Oh my god." I feel more like that towards Natalie Portman and Daisy Ridley in the later two trilogies. I honestly never really found Carrie Fisher that attractive. Maybe some guys do. I could see how some guys would find her attractive. Personally, for me, I wasn't impressed. No disrespect, but she's not my kind of woman. I'm just saying. There's also another change in this scene where Lando is about to get pulled in by the Sarlacc. Han and Chewie are trying to pull him up, and Han manages to fire a blast onto the one tentacle from the Sarlacc, which saves him. In the original cut, he goes, "It's all right, trust me." But in this one,
Oh, wait, I thought you were blind! It's all right, I can see a lot better.
actually, I think that's a much better exchange. And the audience I saw the movie with, they legitimately laughed at that moment. One among a few other things that was done right in the special editions. So Jabba's barge is destroyed, they manage to get away, going their separate ways to the Alliance, and Luke heads back to Dagobah. And we see Yoda, who's about ready to cross over to the other side. And he tells Luke that there's nothing left for him to learn, but he has to confront Vader in order to fully become a Jedi. And I don't want to go on a big spiel here, but as far as Luke becoming more skilled by this time in the trilogy, it's really great to see, but this is something that I've always been kind of puzzled by. We're told in this movie that this is the first time in about a year that he's come back to Dagobah, and yet somehow he's able to become a lot more skilled with the Force and as a Jedi. So what exactly was the training for him in between those two movies? If you tell me it says so in this book or that book, okay, fine, I'm not trying to speak down against that, but in the movies, it's not really that clear. And it's the same thing with Empire. We don't know exactly how long Luke was on Dagobah. I've heard some people argue maybe it was a couple of months, but if I had to guess, it was probably about a week, maybe more if that. It's not really clear at that point how much training he's had and what exactly he did in between. It's not a critique against the original trilogy. I mean, maybe it is in a way, but it's not. I would say I'm not trying to put it down or anything. My ultimate point is that people are okay with Luke being like that in this trilogy, but Rey trains under Luke and Leia for about a year or so, and she's still a Mary Sue.
Yeah, okay.
But in any case, I do like the final conversation that Luke and Yoda have, warning him about what the Emperor is capable of, and also reprimanding him in a way for going after Vader too soon, not really fully prepared to face the truth about his father, confirming that Vader was indeed Luke's father all along. And I can imagine in that 3-year interim between Empire and Jedi, people were wondering, you can find news articles that are out there somewhere online. People were wondering, was Vader telling him the truth, or was he just lying in order to try to seduce him into the darkness? If you don't know the full picture at that point, it was a pretty reasonable guess to assume that he was lying. I mean, dark side Force users aren't exactly the most trustworthy people. Similar thing that we experienced not too long ago with whether or not Rey was actually a nobody and whether Kylo Ren was actually lying to her. And of course, we know that Rey was actually indeed a Palpatine, but that's besides the point. But I could easily see people at the time with all those questions still flowing through their head when they hear Yoda say,
"Your father is."
oh my god, finally, we got an answer. He is his father. And there's also another little line.
"When gone am I, the last of the Jedi will you be. Pass on what you have learned."
knowing what happens in the sequel trilogy, in particular The Last Jedi, that line hits a lot harder now since he reminds him of that when he shows up as a Force ghost in Episode 8. And then with his dying breath, he reveals that there is another Skywalker. And then we later see Obi-Wan show up as a Force ghost and confirming the truth about Anakin, going into more detail about what exactly went on. And knowing how things happened in the prequels, it does add more layers of emotion to it. And there's one little moment that Luke has where he says, "I can't do it, Ben.
You must face Darth Vader again."
I can't kill my own father.
I've heard some people criticize Luke in this moment, saying that he was too stubborn or was too much in denial. Well, he wasn't actually. Vader is still a good person underneath. But I don't really see that as a problem. While in a way, yeah, I did kind of find myself saying to Luke, come on, Luke. Really? Are you really that stubborn? But ultimately, he's right. Vader is still a good person deep down. Now, I obviously was not in Luke's position throughout my life. I had both parents in my life as I was growing up. But in a way, I can also kind of relate to what Luke was saying. Even though my dad was present in my life, he and I were never exactly close. He spent a lot of time with his work and providing for our family, but he wasn't really there for me or my sister in the ways that we needed him. There's other things too that I'm not going to go into that led to some friction between the two of us. But at one point I was actually really hoping and praying that maybe some way, somehow, my dad was going to see the error of his ways and come around and maybe try to repair some of the damage. Someone like Luke, who has never known his father at all up until now in this point in the trilogy and in his life. He doesn't want to believe that his father's all bad, because if his father's all bad, then he in some way is also bad because they're related by blood. And I would imagine that's a common thing you see in kids who don't really know their real parents. But of course, Luke knows better many years later when he tells Rey that some things are stronger than blood. So yeah, that criticism I can't really get behind. But in the same moment, we get to learn a little more about Luke's sister and how she was hidden from the Emperor and their father. And then Luke does some little soul searching deep down with the Force and realizes that Leia was his sister all along. Originally, this was not the plan. His sister was supposed to be a totally different character from Leia, but they decided at the last second to make Luke and Leia brother and sister, which is another great layer, but it's also really awkward. When you think about the kiss that they had in Empire Strikes Back and Luke was just in heaven over that.
Excuse me, I have to go and vomit.
And not to keep going on tangents or anything, but this was another example of things not being carefully planned out with this trilogy. Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking, but the sequel trilogy had no plan. They should have done this or this.
Yes, I know that.
And I'm not saying that you're wrong. They should have had a plan, but we're talking about this trilogy, okay? This is something that I hear constantly over and over and over again when people talk about how there was not one singular vision in the sequel trilogy, whereas the original and prequel trilogies had more of a consistent vision. In the case of the original trilogy, maybe that's true, yeah, but there was other things too that they changed along the way. Vader was not supposed to be Luke's dad initially. Obi-Wan was supposed to be the one who killed Anakin Skywalker, but then they decided, let's make Vader Luke's dad, that's even better. But let's stop acting like the original trilogy was carefully planned out, because it really wasn't. So inevitably, Luke reunites with Leia and Han on the command ship of the Rebel Alliance, and we get the same type of expositionary scene of how the plan's going to go out with the attack on the Death Star with Admiral Akbar and Mon Mothma, who, having seen Andor and the Rogue One movie, it's a little interesting to see where she is now, knowing some of her backstory in the previous movies and shows. Lando is now a general, and he and Han are actually on friendly terms now. There's a little criticism here. Wait a minute, you sold me out to Darth Vader and Boba Fett, and all of a sudden those two are happy friends again? Now, if there was an extra scene or two of them maybe talking it out, maybe Han could have had a moment where he said, look, I understand why you did it. You were trying to help your people. It's all good. I probably would have done the same thing if I were you. More than likely they had that conversation off screen, but I think that an extra scene or two would have sufficed. It's not a big problem for me. It just, I think, needed a little more clarification. There's all these other characters in here too as they're going over the plan, with Luke, Han, and Leia and Chewie taking a team of rebel soldiers to the moon with a stolen Imperial shuttle, which if you played Star Wars Rogue Squadron Rogue Leader, there's a level in that game where you actually steal the shuttle as Wedge Antilles, whether it's at the daytime or in the middle of the night, depending on when you play that level. It goes by the time on the GameCube clock. If you played the game during the day, you do the mission in the daytime. If you play it at night, after a certain time, you can play it during the nighttime. Remembering those details of that level kind of put a smile on my face as a big fan. I just couldn't help it. Seeing the General Crix Madine who communicates with Wedge in that level and throughout the last half of the game, I'm sorry, I just got giddy thinking about that. I thought, oh my god, it's Crix Madine! Oh yeah, that's Wedge! Oh, that's right, they stole the shuttle! I'm a crazy fanboy right now, but I just can't help myself. So they take the shuttle using an old code, trying to lie their way past this Imperial blockade. Of course, with Luke being on the shuttle, Vader being on the command ship, they can sense each other's presence. But I do like the tension that we get in that moment where Luke realizes that Vader's there, and the rest of the team is unsure on whether or not they're going to call their bluff.
But don't look like you're trying to keep your distance. I don't know. Fly casual.
And then later on, when they end up on Endor and they see the scout troopers from far away, which is probably my favorite action sequence in this whole movie. I think it's pretty obvious that they shot this in front of a backdrop image or something. I never really looked into the behind the scenes production of this stuff. The way they shot this and the way it's composed, and there's really no music in this sequence, in its own unique way, I think it's really exciting. I love John Williams' music, but I think the lack of music really helps this sequence. Well, at least up until the chase actually begins. From the moment of Luke jumping onto the other speeder bike, him shooting the other speeder bike as it crashes into the tree, and then Luke cutting off the front end of the one speeder, which goes into a spiral crashing into that other tree. And thanks to the movie Without a Paddle with Seth Green and Matthew Lillard, I cannot look at that speeder bike chase the same way anymore. Then there's the introduction of Wicket, the Ewok. The Ewoks are a point of contention, or at least the first one, from the Star Wars fandom that nobody really seemed to care for. They thought it was too cutesy, and they found it really hard to believe that this tribe of teddy bears would take down a highly trained army. While I agree with that, and I think that maybe if they were Wookiees, I can buy that they would defeat skillfully trained soldiers. But even so, they do play an important part in defeating the Empire. So I don't really think it's necessarily a problem. The only problem I have with it, though, is I think it slows the movie down too much, and we're just kind of going off on this little side quest, learning about this tribe, and by the time we get to the conversation that Luke and Leia have about Vader, that's when I think the movie really picks up again. I think there's like maybe a 10 or 15 minute stretch, I don't know exactly, where they're just kind of hanging around with the teddy bears. We're all just happy that we're getting accepted into the tribe, even though we were about to be eaten by these things a few minutes ago. It's kind of odd and ridiculous that they would eat these people for food, and they don't even kill them in order to cook them, so that way they wouldn't try to resist. But then again, if they didn't play it out this way, we wouldn't have gotten some of the funniest lines and great moments. Somehow I got the feeling that didn't help us very much. Han, can you reach my lightsaber? Yeah, sure. And I just love the fact that these Ewoks think that 3PO's a god and they're all bowing to him. And it leads to this.
Well, why don't you use your divine influence and get us out of this?
I beg your pardon, General Solo, but that just wouldn't be proper.
Proper?
It's against my programming to impersonate a deity.
The fact that Mark Hamill is trying really hard not to break character by bursting out in laughter, another small detail that I absolutely adore. Not to mention that Harrison Ford takes it so seriously in that moment with that look of disgust and appallment. Is that the right word? Appallment? But looking appalled, we'll go with that. And then we get a really great scene where Luke talks with Leia about his father and what she remembers about her mom, Padme, as we all know in hindsight. And it's another thing where George, should have planned this out a little more carefully. I'm not trying to sound mean to George Lucas. I know that criticizing his creative choices is old news by now, since most people anyway love the prequels now, which is fine. I'm not trying to say that they're wrong. But Luke asks Leia if she remembers her mom, and she says she does, and that she died when she was very young. But if you've seen Revenge of the Sith, she was an infant. She was just born, and Padme dies not too long after that. How exactly does she remember those details? I'll save that for a prequel video, but it's another example that somebody should have kept George in line and said, George, that doesn't make any sense because of what happened in this movie. You gotta make it line up. But hearing Luke say this line, that where the Force is strong in his family, my father has it, I have it, and my sister has it. And Leia's look of shock and disbelief. Even with the awkward kiss aside, I love how they played this out because it adds a whole different layer of relatability and emotion to Leia, because I don't think the character was that compelling on paper. And I wish they gave her more to do character work-wise, like Luke had, and maybe Han to a certain degree. But even so, I really like the idea of them being siblings, because obviously there was a connection between the two. Even if they took out the romantic aspects of it, I still think that they could have had something like, okay, no, I'm not into you, but we care for each other very deeply and we want what's best for each other. So I'm totally okay with them being twins. I just think that aspects of the writing and the planning could have been better thought out, just me personally. And I love the image of Luke in the darkness and Leia in the light, since Leia is now the new hope for the Alliance. And when Luke tells her that you have that power and in time you'll learn to use it as I have, we all know how that turned out in Rise of Skywalker when she reached out to Ben Solo in Episode 9. So I guess that little detail, maybe in a way that was foreshadowing what was to come. I know, obvious stretch, but still, it's hard not to notice that stuff. Then we get the scene where Luke turns himself over to Darth Vader, and this whole exchange is riveting. And I probably stated earlier, my brain's mush right now, but This is the reason why this movie is my favorite Star Wars movie, because the dynamic between Luke and Vader, how he's trying to save his father, and how his father inevitably comes to that moment of redemption. And this little line here,
"Come with me."
Obi-Wan once thought as you do.
thank God the Kenobi series cleared that up. This scene hits so differently now in retrospect. And I think the scene does masterfully at showing how conflicted Vader is deep down, even though he's wearing a mask. The camera angles, the music, even without his line of, "It's too late for me, son." It's pretty clear that this guy actually does care about his son still. And knowing that he wanted to protect Padme, it awakened something inside of him that was dormant for so many years. I just realized I haven't talked much about this. Ian McDiarmid is amazing as the Emperor. He's credited as the Emperor in this movie. He's not called Palpatine, but in retrospect, obviously, he's known as Palpatine. At the time, I believe Ian McDiarmid was in his 30s or 40s, and the makeup effects that they put on him was astounding, and it's really creepy. And when he walks out of that Imperial shuttle for the first time and all the stormtroopers and officers are all standing at attention waiting for him to show up, and that eerie sound of music from John Williams excellently shows the audience that this guy is even worse than Vader, even scarier. And of course, I can't talk about the Emperor without discussing the line delivery. Similar to Willem Dafoe's line delivery as the Green Goblin or Heath Ledger's line delivery as the Joker, it's so quotable that I think any Star Wars fan or maybe any casual movie fan would probably recognize that in some capacity or know that's from Star Wars some way, somehow. "We are quite safe from your pitiful little band. An entire legion of my best troops awaits them." I get so much joy just watching Ian McDiarmid chew up every single line. It's brilliant acting on his part. I don't know how else to put it. I really don't. So inevitably the Battle of Endor kicks up, on the ground and in space, and the battle between Luke and Vader on the Death Star. 3 different things happening all at once. Another indicator that George Lucas was kind of starting to go a little off the rails creatively. I don't think it's really that big of a deal because they're all relating to each other and how the battle's going. It's not all so scatterbrained. Each conflict starts in its own way and almost in sync with each other. Things start out somewhat promising, then it gets a little bit dour, and then it kicks back up again with some excitement and optimism. From Lando flying the Falcon and the fleet arriving at the Death Star realizing that it's a trap! The Ewoks showing up to ambush the Imperial forces in the area, using their primitive attempts to destroy the AT-ST walkers, which doesn't really have much effect. Hitting the stormtroopers with sticks and bolas. Obviously, yes, it's ridiculous, but it's similar to how I felt about Boba Fett dying in the way he did. I think it's really hilarious in its own way. I've also heard that George Lucas was using this as a commentary for the Viet Cong attacking against the South Vietnamese and United States military forces during the Vietnam War. Having that knowledge in mind, I think that's actually kind of a neat little detail. And George Lucas loves his historical parallels in his pieces of fiction. So for anyone who complains that the sequel trilogy was too political, well, the original and prequel trilogies were doing somewhat of a similar thing, and I guarantee you, if this were to come out today, people like Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson would be crying foul over stuff like this. And maybe some other YouTube grifters that like to fan the flames of political controversy. You could probably guess who they are. But the Endor space battle is probably my personal favorite out of all the movies. When you put it together alone with those moments, so many great shots in this sequence, from the Falcon flying right past the medical frigate, the Superstar Destroyer finally getting blown up while it crashes into the Death Star, and Admiral Akbar having a sigh of relief that they're actually winning. All an indication of how this movie feels to the general audience. Like, oh, God, finally. And the same thing happens when eventually Chewie manages to take control of an AT-ST with 2 Ewoks, and he and Han come up with a trap to get back into the bunker, and Han does his famous pose. Something that his wife and son did in their own respective ways too. Runs in the families, I guess. And my eyes never cease to glue to the screen with the final battle between Luke and Vader. Luke kicking Vader away down the stairs, the Emperor constantly taunting him in his ear, Luke trying to stand back and say, "No, I'm not going to fight you." Almost kind of reminds me of Cap and Bucky in the second Captain America movie when they're fighting on the helicarrier. And then Luke jumps up onto a railway, and I would imagine Vader had a flashback to something that happened on Mustafar many decades ago. Then we get the moment where Luke is taunted by Vader as he's hiding in the shadows. Half of his face is in the dark, the other's in the light. Clearly conflicted in that moment, especially when Vader finds out that Luke has a sister and says, "You know what? You're not going to turn? How about I go turn your sister to the dark side instead?" And Luke blows his stack, slashing away at Vader, and Vader starts to back up thinking, oh crap, okay, I should not have said that at all. Eventually Luke cuts off his hand, but when Luke looks at his hand and he sees Vader's cut off arm, he realizes what he's becoming, and he throws the lightsaber away.
"You failed, Your Highness. I am a Jedi, like my father before me."
Most Jedi thing you could ever do. And then we get my favorite scene in the entire movie, where Vader decides to save his son. The Emperor decides, okay, you don't want to come along with me? Then I'll just kill you. Shoots the lightning at Luke. Luke doesn't even try to put up a fight at all, but he's begging for his father to do something. Vader's just standing there watching this. And I would imagine that at the time when people first saw this, him shooting lightning out of his hands, if I were seeing this for the first time, I'd probably think, whoa! How do you fight that? I had a similar experience with Last Jedi when Rey and Kylo Ren talked to each other through the Force plane. Totally different discussion, but you'll get what I mean. But what I love about this scene is that it cuts from the Emperor to Luke and then back to Vader. The camera zooms in on Vader. Very, very obvious that Vader's conflicted in this moment. Luke has gotten through to him and shown him that he is still a good person deep down. And I would imagine he probably had a flashback to what happened with Mace Windu and Palpatine a long time ago. With all the other stuff that's happened in his life, he finally decides, no, I'm not losing my son. Oh my god, that is so good. So great. But I do have to mention the elephant in the room here. The special edition change in that scene. Oh, mother of God. Okay, I know I sound like a typical ranting Star Wars fanboy right now, but I can accept some of the changes in this movie. But this one, I knew it was coming. I knew exactly what was going to happen. Even though I plugged my ears as hard as I could still hear him screaming, no! And I know it's not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things, but there was no point to that. You didn't need to put that in there. It was fine the way it was. Sometimes not saying anything is the best way to convey emotion. And it's a symptom of George Lucas thinking that his audience is not going to understand what's going on with his characters unless he actually makes them say what's on their minds and hearts. And in this case, I think it's completely unnecessary. I was willing to let it slide when I saw it in the theater because I knew it was the special edition. That's why I have the despecialized edition, because he doesn't do it in that one. I don't want to sound like a typical Star Wars fanboy once again, because I try really hard not to be, but that change alone just made me say, no, I can't buy these Blu-rays. I can't do it. Then we get the really sad scene of Vader's death. This exchange alone literally makes me want to bawl like a baby. And we get to see Vader unmasked, where he's all charred and burned up. And we as the audience get to say, okay, that makes sense why this guy would treat people the way he did, because he's broken. I'm even getting emotional just talking about that stuff. It is such a beautiful moment that it never ceases to get an emotional response out of me. Oh, and I just remembered something. When Palpatine is thrown down the reactor chute, like I said with Boba Fett with the Mandalorian series, I did say out loud, see you in episode 9. I was wondering if this movie was going to be ruined in some capacity, since many fans have pointed out that Darth Vader killing the Emperor is now rendered unimportant since he came back. I don't agree with that at all. I mean, I could see why some people would say that. I personally have never felt that way, because it wasn't really about Vader killing his abuser and fulfilling some chosen one prophecy. The important thing about that scene was that he saved his son's life. He saved who he loved the most. That was more important to him than fulfilling some prophecy that may or may not have been correct about him some time ago. If he didn't save Luke, Vader and the Empire would have won, and therefore Luke wouldn't have been able to live to train Ben Solo, Leia would have been gone, Han would have been dead, Ben Solo would never have been born and trained under Luke Skywalker, and he never would have been able to help Rey defeat the First Order and the Emperor in The Rise of Skywalker with the training and mentorship of Leia and Luke Skywalker. So if Vader hadn't saved his son, none of that stuff would have happened in the first place. It all goes back to Anakin. And he even says in the Voices of the Jedi Past in Rise of Skywalker to Rey, bring back the balance, as I did. Whether or not I actually like the Chosen One story arc, well, we'll save that for a later time. And as for the celebration scene, where we get to see the different planets like Bespin, Naboo, and Tatooine, and Coruscant celebrating the end of the Empire, that change I actually really like, because in the original cut, we didn't really get to see what was going on, obviously, where we were just stuck on Endor. And I guess maybe some people would have thought, is this really it? Is this all we're doing? Nobody else is feeling this way. But seeing how the rest of the galaxy felt about the Emperor and the Empire's rule, it's perfectly reasonable that they would get excited over this stuff. Word would get out pretty quickly what was going on. And it almost kind of reminds me of those World War II celebration pictures that we've seen in history books, where everybody was celebrating the end of the war. And the musical piece that John Williams composed for this edition is perfect. And especially as it transitions to Endor, which sounds kind of like what you would hear in a tribal celebration of some kind, I guess, by the Ewoks. But I still prefer Yub Nub, though. I think in its own way, it's a lot more more powerful emotionally, especially when Luke comes back and reunites with Leia and Han. It's kind of a take your pick, really. I don't really think there's a problem with either or. I prefer Yub Nub, but I also really like the new musical piece that Williams composed too. And as for the Force Ghosts moment with Yoda, Obi-Wan, and Anakin, in the special edition change, it's Hayden Christensen. I don't know exactly how George managed to get that together. I think maybe it was some footage that somebody shot when he was standing around in costume and he superimposed that onto the original actor's body. I get it, for continuity purposes, you want to try to keep that consistent, and Lucas's reasoning for that was, well, that's how Vader was last time he was good. Well, actually, he was good right before he died when he saved Luke from the Emperor, so wouldn't that same logic apply there? I get what Lucas was trying to go for, but seeing it in execution, it doesn't really make any sense. And I think it's also kind of disrespectful to the original actor who played Anakin. I think he died sometime after the film came out, and I don't really think Hayden Christensen fits in the tone of that scene. It just feels really out of place for me. And especially with his facial expressions too, it just looks really awkward and bizarre. I'm not trying to sound disrespectful to the guy. I know he's gotten his fair share of flack from the critics and some fans, but like with the Darth Vader special edition change, the original scene was fine the way it was. You didn't really need to do that stuff. But still, the intention of that moment actually really hits, because when you see this older gentleman show up next to Yoda and Obi-Wan, you as the audience start to go, wait, who's that? Oh my god, it's Darth Vader! Seeing Obi-Wan reuniting with his friend, who wrote him off as a more machine now than man, twisted and evil, which also hits harder in hindsight with the Kenobi series, so many ways extremely satisfying. As with the final image with all of them celebrating with the Ewoks, and all seems right with the galaxy. At least until the sequel trilogy 30 years later. So those are my thoughts on Star Wars Return of the Jedi. I think it's very underappreciated in comparison to some of the other ones. Maybe had some more flaws than I originally thought it did, but even so, its place in the grander Star Wars universe, knowing all the other things that happened before and afterwards in the timeline, all the story and character beats that it hits, strikes me in a very unique fashion now, knowing where things have gone before and afterward. Force Awakens is still my favorite Star Wars movie of all time, but this one is a very close second, and I will die on that hill. That's all I got to say about Return of the Jedi. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are on this movie. Either way, let's just try to keep it civil in the comments section, please. So thanks again, guys. I'll see you in the next one.